Okay, so like as philosophers, right, we kind of swim in this sea of like what's real, what's possible, what has to be. It's basically our bread and butter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And it's amazing to think that, like, way back when, some serious brainiacs like this guy Leibniz were wrestling with those same big questions. And their ideas are still super relevant, even now.
Totally. And for today's deep dive, we're taking a deep dive into this one awesome area, Leibniz's modal metaphysics. Basically, his theories of necessity, possibility, and all that jazz.
Right on. We're using this really in-depth entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's like the gold standard on this stuff.
Yeah.
But the goal here isn't just to like regurgitate information. It's to like really unpack Leibniz's thoughts in a way that makes sense to us, as philosophers, and hopefully even helps us connect the dots in new ways.
Awesome. So think of this as like an exploration of Leibniz's mind. We're going to try to get into his head, see how he saw things, and then see how that all fits into the bigger picture of modal thinking.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Okay, so like Leibniz's whole system seems to hinge on this idea of the individual substance. What's he getting at with that?
Well, for Leibniz, an individual substance is like a complete self-contained being. And what defines it is its complete individual concept, or CIC. It's like a God's eye view blueprint of everything that's true about that specific individual, past, present, and future. Like he used the example of Alexander the Great. God doesn't just see him conquering Darius. He sees everything, like his education under Aristotle, every little decision he made, every move his armies made, everything. It's all there in the CIC.
So it's like the ultimate essence of an individual,
Right.
right? And God can basically see all these blueprints. No two are alike either, right?
Exactly. And that leads to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, or, the PII. It says no two substances can be exactly alike, but like numerically different. If they shared every single quality, they'd be the same thing.
Makes sense. So no cosmic doppelbangers. Got it. So you've got these unique individual substances, each with its own CIC, but how do they all fit together? What's a world in Leibniz's view?
A world is basically a bunch of these individual substances, what he calls a collection of finite things. And it's specifically a collection of compossibles.
Compossibles. Okay, I'm going to need a little help with that one. What exactly are compossibles?
They're basically things that God could put together in a world without contradicting himself. Even God can't create a square circle. It's just not logically possible.
Right, okay. Any examples of this compossibility thing?
Well, the SC uses this example of two guys, Don and Ron. They both can't be the tallest guy at the same time. That's a contradiction. But they can both be over, say, 6 feet tall at the same time. No problem there. Actually, Leibniz wasn't a huge fan of examples using relational properties like tallest. He thought compossibility was better understood in terms of, like, perceptions and how substances fit together in a world.
Okay, so perceptions. How does that tie into compossibility?
Think of it this way. If Don has a perception of the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, for Ron to be compossible with him, his whole perceptual history has to line up with that too. Like, his world also has to have a USA, a space program, a moon landing on that date and all that. If Ron's world doesn't have that, then they're not compossible.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So a world isn't just a random jumble of stuff, it's super interconnected.
Exactly. And there's another piece of the puzzle, the laws of nature.
Right, the SAP talks about that too. How do those laws fit into all of this?
Okay, so Leibniz thought there are like tons of different ways God could set up a world, each with its own laws, right? He called these primary free decrees. Imagine the same set of individual substances. God could put them in a world with, let's say, laws L, or he could use different laws like L prime. Each choice creates a different possible world.
So it's like God has this massive collection of rule books he can choose from.
Totally. But here's the kicker. Different laws don't just govern things differently. They actually change the properties and perceptions of the substances themselves. So the substances under laws L are literally different beings than those under laws L prime, even if their like base blueprints are the same.
Whoa. So the laws of nature are like woven into the very fabric of beings. That's intense. And this takes us to Leibniz's big idea, God choosing the best of all possible worlds, right?
There you go. Leibniz believed that God, being perfectly good and rational, would obviously choose the best possible world. And best for him didn't just mean the most happiness or the least suffering. He thought the best world was the one that has the most stuff happening, but with the simplest, most elegant laws.
So the laws themselves are part of God's choice.
Exactly. He picks the system that creates the most awesome reality with the fewest moving parts.
Okay, I think I'm getting this. So a possible world is like a complete package deal. Compossible substances, specific laws, all that. And the actual world is the one God chose because it's the best, the most perfect.
Hmm.
And Leibniz was totally convinced that other possible worlds exist, even if we can't, visit them.
Right. He even said there are an infinite number of possible worlds, as many as there are non-contradictory series of things you can imagine.
I did notice the essay mentioned this kind of simpler argument for infinite worlds, something about one object worlds.
Yeah, it's kind of a basic argument. It just says you could imagine endless single object worlds, each with different properties, like a blue bowling ball world, a red one, a pizza world, and so on. Each one's possible, so infinite worlds.
Okay, I see the logic. But Leibniz had his own more complex arguments, right? Something about novels and how complete series can't be contained in others.
Yes. In his work on contingency, he argues that if every possibility existed somewhere, every novel ever written would have to be real, which is obviously not the case. He also talks about how different possibilities might conflict with each other. Like, if this happened, then that couldn't happen. It's like they get in each other's way. So each complete series has to be its own thing, and there are infinitely many of them. And novels are just like little glimpses into these possibilities.
So these possible worlds are like ideas in God's mind, right?
Fun.
What about the beings in them? Do they also exist in some way before they become actual?
Well, absolutely. For Leibniz, each possible individual has a complete individual concept, its essence. And these essences exist eternally in God's mind. It's like God's big book of blueprints. He even says in his Theodicy that all possibles exist in the realm of eternal verities. And in his monadology, he argues that these essences have to ultimately be grounded in something that actually exists, which is God.
This sounds like a very different view than, say, Spinoza, who we talked about before.
For sure. Spinoza, in his Ethics, denied the existence of unactualized possibles. For him, everything possible will eventually exist as God or nature unfolds. So for Spinoza, there's just this one totally necessary world. The difference is that Leibniz saw God as having a separate intellect and will, so God can think about a bunch of possibilities without actually making them all real.
The Seppi also talks about Carnap and Plantinga connecting to Leibniz. What's that about?
So Carnap, in his book Meaning and Necessity, suggested that you could represent Leibniz's possible worlds with these things called state descriptions. They're basically like complete lists of every fact in a possible world. And then Plantinga, building on that, came up with the idea of a world book, which is basically a giant book describing everything that happens in a specific possible world.
It's like each world has its own detailed history book. That's neat. Then there's that really cool parable in Theodicy, the one about Theodorus and the Palace of Fates. I love that one.
Oh yeah, that's a classic. So Theodorus sees this guy Sextus complaining to Jupiter about his bad luck. And then he gets taken to this Palace of Fates, where he sees depictions of everything that happens and everything that could happen. Athena explains that Jupiter looked at all the possibilities and chose the best one to make real. She even says that for any difference you can imagine from the actual world, there's a possible world for it. All these worlds exist as ideas in God's mind.
It's like God's got this massive library of alternate histories.
Exactly. And then there's the pyramid of worlds, with the best one at the top and infinitely many less perfect ones going down forever. The point is, these worlds are ideas, not real places you can visit.
That's an important distinction. So how did Leibniz define like necessity, possibility, contingency? Did he use the modern idea of truth across possible worlds?
Well, while his ideas kind of set the stage for that, his main account used his theories of truth and infinite analysis.
Okay, infinite analysis. What's that all about?
So Leibniz said, necessary propositions are those where you can break down the terms and eventually reach a point where the predicate is clearly contained in the subject. It's like the ultimate does statement, like a bachelor is an unmarried man. The analysis stops there. It's obvious.
So with necessary truths, it's all about breaking things down until it's super obvious.
Exactly. Even if it takes like infinite steps. Think of 2 + 2, 4. If you break it down, it becomes 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. That's an identity. It's undeniable.
And didn't Kant call these truths analytic judgments? But he disagreed with Leibniz about whether math really fits that category.
Right. Kant called them analytic, but he thought basic math was actually synthetic a priori. But a lot of philosophers today think Leibniz was right on that one.
Okay, so for Leibniz, necessity equals reaching an identity. What about contingent truths? How do those work with infinite analysis?
Contingent truths are the tricky ones. With them, the analysis goes on forever. You never reach a final identity. There's always a reason why something's true, but we can't grasp the whole chain of reasons. It's infinite. God, though, can see the whole thing at once, like with one glance.
So God knows why, but we don't.
Yep. Leibniz compares it to rational and irrational numbers. Sometimes the analysis ends, sometimes it just keeps going.
Got it. So for contingent truth, the ultimate reason is God choosing this specific world with this specific chain of events, right?
Right on.
Okay, so how about possibility and impossibility? Where do those fit into Leibniz's infinite analysis thing?
Basically, something's possible if you can analyze it forever without hitting a contradiction. Like, you never get to a point where you're saying A is not A. Impossibility is when you do hit a contradiction.
So no square circles allowed.
Exactly.
It seems like, even though Leibniz didn't use our fancy modern jargon of possible worlds, his ideas really set the stage for that kind of thinking. Like, his ideas about truth and infinite analysis map pretty well onto how we think about possibility and necessity today.
Oh, for sure. In his discourse on metaphysics, he even makes a distinction that sounds a lot like possible world semantics. He talks about necessary truths, where the opposite would be a contradiction, and contingent truths, which depend on God's choices. That's basically the same idea as necessary truths being true in all possible worlds and contingent ones being true in some but not others.
The example of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon is helpful, right? It happened in our world, but it wasn't logically necessary. He could have stayed in Gaul, and that wouldn't have broken any logic rules.
Exactly. We can imagine a possible world where a Caesar-like dude made a different choice. The reason our Caesar crossed the Rubicon is ultimately because of God's choice of this world with this specific sequence of events.
But Caesar couldn't have turned into a fish, right? That would be a contradiction.
Nope, that would violate his specific essence, as we'll discuss later.
Interesting. And it's cool that Leibniz initially thought about possibility in terms of fictional worlds before he went all in on infinite analysis.
Yeah, those two ideas were definitely connected for him. And the essay points out that his idea of infinite analysis actually depends on there being infinite possible worlds. It's like you need those other possibilities for contingent truths to even make sense.
Okay, I see that. So let's move on to Leibnizian essentialism. This seems to flow naturally from the whole complete individual concept thing. If everything about an individual is in its CIC, does that mean every single property is essential to it?
That's the heart of Leibniz's super strong version of essentialism, what some call super essentialism. Normal essentialism just says some properties are necessary for a thing to exist. But super essentialism says every single property is necessary. Like, change one tiny thing and it's a totally different individual.
That seems really extreme. Like, surely whether I'm married or not isn't essential to who I am, and that's what Arnaud argued, right?
He did. He pointed out that changing some properties doesn't change what a thing fundamentally is. Like, being married or single doesn't change you as a person. And a block of marble is still the same block whether it's moving or not.
Good point. How did Leibniz deal with that? Didn't he use the example of Adam?
Yeah, he said when we talk about Adam, we often mean a general kind of Adam, like the first human in the Garden of Eden. But that doesn't specify a unique individual. There could be many possible Adams who fit that description. The actual Adam, let's call an Adamat, is the one with the complete individual concept that includes all his specific details.
So if Adam had made different choices, like not eating the apple, he wouldn't be Adamat. He'd be a different possible Adam.
Totally. Leibniz said that even a tiny change in events would make it a different atom. This goes back to the identity of indiscernibles. Change one property and you have a different thing. He even says in Discourse on Metaphysics that Judas wouldn't be Judas if he hadn't betrayed Jesus.
So for Leibniz, there's no such thing as the same individual existing in different possible worlds with different properties.
Right, individuals are tied to their specific world. But he does talk about vague atoms, which are like incomplete concepts that share some properties with the actual atom. These are what we might call counterparts in other worlds. So when we think of a sinless Adam, we're thinking of his counterpart in another world, not the same guy with a different history. Leibniz even mentions several sextuses in Theodicy, hinting at this idea.
But if every property is essential, how do we tell the difference between, like, super important properties and random ones? Is my rationality as essential as the color of my shirt?
That's a great question. Leibniz addressed this in general inquiries. He said some properties define a species and some are just accidents. Like, to be human, you have to be rational. That can't change without you ceasing to be human, but you can stop being a king or a scholar without ceasing to exist. although technically Leibniz would say it's a slightly different view.
I see. And the SEP talks about specific essential and individuating essential properties. What's the difference?
Specific essential properties define what kind of thing you are. For humans, that's rationality, being a featherless biped, that sort of thing. Everyone in a species shares those. Individuating essential properties are what make you, you. All your actions, experiences, your whole unique history.
So going back to the atom example, any counterpart of atomat in another world would still have to be human to be considered a counterpart, right?
Exactly. They have to share those core human properties. Leibniz, on Freedom, Fate, and the Grace of God, says losing a specific essential property destroys the individual completely. But losing an individuating essential property just means it's not that individual anymore. So if you lose rationality, you're not human anymore. But if Peter hadn't denied Christ, he'd still be Peter, just a different version of him.
Okay, that makes sense. So Leibniz is kind of traditional in seeing essential differences between species, like humans being rational, but he's radical in saying every single property is essential to a specific individual.
Right. He mixes the traditional with the super specific. Now, how about we tackle this whole human freedom thing? If everything's in the complete individual concept, where does free will fit in?
Right. It seems like a deterministic system. How do we make choices if it's all predetermined? The SEP mentions these two labyrinths Leibniz talks about, the labyrinth of the continuum and the labyrinth of freedom.
Yes. On contingency, he links the complexities of infinity to both the infinite divisibility of things and the mind-boggling nature of free will. He's a compatibilist, meaning he thinks free will and determinism can coexist. He says Caesar crossing the Rubicon was free because it came from Caesar's own nature and was his choice at that moment given everything going on.
But if it was already in a CIC, how was it a real choice?
Well, here's the key. While God knew Caesar would cross the Rubicon, it wasn't logically necessary. Caesar staying in Gaul wouldn't have been a contradiction. We can imagine another world where a Caesar-like guy stayed put. So it was certain but not necessary. And of course, Caesar couldn't have transformed into a trout. That would violate his essential human nature.
So things are certain because God chose this world, but they weren't logically forced to happen that way.
Exactly. Leibniz is big on this difference between certainty and necessity. He even says God inclines our souls without necessitating them. So when God chose this world, he chose our complete individual concepts, which include our free actions. It's all determined, but not in a way that rules out genuine choice.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how that works. So finally, the big question. Why this world? Why did God choose this one?
Ah, yes, Leibniz's famous optimism. He truly believed this is the best of all possible worlds. The ACA talks about Adams's divine choice theory, which says God, being perfect, looked at all the possibilities and picked the best one. Leibniz gives a few reasons for this. The simple laws and the awesome stuff they create, the happiness of minds, and the idea that there are tons of different perspectives, with each individual reflecting the whole universe in its own unique way.
But then there's this other idea of striving possibles, where essences basically compete to exist.
Yeah, that's from On the Ultimate Origination of Things. The idea is that each essence has a drive to exist, and the more perfect it is, the stronger the drive. So the actual world is like the result of this metaphysical battle royale, where the best, most compatible essences win.
So is it God choosing or essences battling it out? Which one is it?
The usual way to reconcile these is to say that divine choice is the real explanation. God chooses. The striving possibles idea is more like a metaphor for how God evaluates things. He picks the best, most compatible essences.
Okay, I can see that. So to wrap up our Leibniz deep dive, his whole system was kind of a response to other philosophers, right? Like Hobbes and Spinoza.
For sure. The SCP points out that he was pushing back against Spinoza's hard determinism and the materialistic views of Hobbes. He wanted to show that a deterministic universe could still have a personal God, real human freedom, and a fundamentally good creation. His modal metaphysics was key to making that all work.
So, to recap, complete individual concepts, possible worlds as ideas in God's mind, necessary and contingent truths through infinite analysis, super-essentialism, and world-bound individuals, free will as certainty without necessity, and finally, why this world is the best, with divine choice and striving possibles. That was a wild ride.
Totally. And for our philosopher listeners, Leibniz's work is still incredibly relevant. It raises all these cool questions about possibility, necessity, and what it means to be an individual. And his ideas laid the groundwork for so much of modern modal logic and semantics. You can't understand this stuff without knowing Leibniz.
So here's something to think about. If you can imagine something, does that automatically make it possible? And how does Leibniz's idea of perfection influence how we see value in existence itself? Definitely worth pondering, right? We encourage you to check out Leibniz's own writings and see what all the fuss is about. It's seriously mind blowing stuff.